Hello everybody and welcome to DenziBlitz. I'm Mike from Electric City Sentai DenziCaster, and I'm kind of excited because we are starting a brand new series this week here on the Blitz. Today we begin our journey through the decade. It's Kamen Rider Decade, the 10th Heisei Rider television series, the 25th main rider overall, Kamen Rider Decade. You can see here beside me a couple of the Kamen Riders that appear in the series, and there are lots. So let's give you a little bit of background before we get started on Kamen Rider Decade and perhaps even the Kamen Rider franchise in general, because here on the Blitz we go through shows pretty quickly. It's our weekly show where we watch a batch of episodes for our Kamen Rider Decade 6-part series. We're going to be doing 5 episodes per one of our episodes. So it's 5 episodes a week until we get to the last week. Part 6 will be a little bit longer because we're going to cover the final 6 episodes of Decade, plus one of the Decade movies that actually serves as the series finale, which in and of itself is pretty unusual for the Kamen Rider franchise. But Kamen Rider as a whole starts back in 1971 with the television series Kamen Rider. The series in the Showa era continues on in its first run for about 5 years. It runs from 71 to 75 across 5 different television series. You have Kamen Rider V3, Kamen Rider X, Kamen Rider Amazon, and Kamen Rider Stronger. It then basically goes on hiatus for a few years. In 1979, it comes back in the form of Kamen Rider. The revived television series initially was meant to be a reboot and stars a new Kamen Rider who is simply referred to as such until they decide to make it the anniversary series that wasn't really an anniversary series, and they bring back all the previous riders in one episode or another, and they refer to our new hero as Sky Rider. So Sky Rider, which is the nickname for that series now in general, or sometimes it's called New Kamen Rider, in 1980 is followed up by Kamen Rider Super 1. And that series would be, well, the last for a little while. When that series is off the air in 81, it's another 3 years before Kamen Rider hits TV screens again, and that is in the form of a television special, Birth of the 10th All Riders Together. It serves as the introduction for Kamen Rider Z-Cross. It was meant to be his pilot episode that would lead into a Z-Cross television series that frankly never happened for one reason or another. Z-Cross lived on. He had a radio special, unless I'm terribly mistaken, and he was one of the lead characters in the manga Kamen Rider Spirits, which gave a drastically different interpretation of the character from the original TV special. So fast forward about another 4 years, and we get to, well, I guess 3 years, we get to Kamen Rider Black in 1987. Black is so successful as a television series that when they do the next show in 1988, Kamen Rider Black RX, they actually bring back the same actor. So we wind up with the first time ever 2 different titled shows with 2 different physical rider costumes being played by the same actor portraying the same character. It had never happened before, that particular 2-series run. Kamen Rider goes off the air in 1989 and would pretty much stay off television for over a decade. Decade. Anyway, Kamen Rider would return in the 1990s in a movie trilogy that are in no way actually interconnected, other than the fact that they're all still considered part of the Showa era of the television history, of the continuity, because they all still have the original creator, Shotaro Shinomori, involved, and they all wind up with characters that are cyborgs, basically the tropes of the Showa era continuing on, and those are Shin Kamen Rider Zero, and Kamen Rider J. Of all of that, we only received 1 television series in the United States, nationwide, and that was Kamen Rider Black RX. Here in the United States, it was known as Saban's Masked Rider, and the less we say about it, the better, probably. We did, however, get Kamen Rider ZO. Most people don't realize that, but it was a Sega CD game, and it was actually a pretty faithful adaptation of the movie because the game was nothing more than a full motion video game, all quick time events, very much like, say, Dragon's Lair or something of that nature, using footage from the movie. So it was pretty much just a quick time event based game using the movie Kamen Rider ZO as its trappings. But we fast forward to the year 2000, and in 2000, Kamen Rider comes back to television. Shotaro Ishinomori had been planning for a new Kamen Rider television series. His death prior to the series debuting put it in perhaps a little bit of jeopardy, but ultimately his notes were used to create Kamen Rider Kuga, who is this guy right here. So if any of you out there are unfamiliar with the Kamen Rider franchise, this is Kamen Rider Kuga. Kuga's television series in 2000 would serve as the first Heisei era Kamen Rider and would be a reintroduction of the franchise. And from this point forward, Kamen Rider was very much like Super Sentai. All the previous Kamen Riders are one world. And one continuity, quite frankly. But starting with Kuga, that all changed. And each year would be a new story, a new Kamen Rider, a new set of powers, new bad guys, just like Super Sentai. That wasn't what was always intended, but that's what happened. With the series Kamen Rider Agito following up Kuga. Well, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Kamen Rider franchise in the Heisei era, Kamen Rider Decade was created, and the basic story behind Decade is our hero, Tsukasa, is a photographer, probably a fairly bad one, who has a working relationship with the Hikari Photo Studio, whether they want it or not. And essentially, in the first appearance we see him, he's a bit of a rip-off artist, but he is looking for his world that he can capture on film, which becomes a little bit telling throughout the series. It's an ongoing trope, or I should say an ongoing thread, perhaps, through the series. But Kamen Rider Decade would be, in many ways, fairly groundbreaking for the Kamen Rider franchise as a whole, in that, and even Tokusatsu, in that it's the first time we have a hero that can transform into his predecessors. We've seen this happen more often now. Ultraman had their version of this with Ultraman X, and of course there was Gokaiger, or Power Rangers Super Mega Force, again. So we've seen this occur many times since Kamen Rider Decade aired in 2009. Kamen Rider Decade was a deliberately abbreviated series. Most Kamen Rider shows, most Tokusatsu shows in general, especially those from Toei, run for a year, usually about 52 episodes in that neighborhood. Sometimes it's as many as 55, sometimes it's as few as, say, 47 or 46. It just depends. Kamen Rider Decade was deliberately 31 episodes long. It was deliberately shorter. That was actually a marketing tactic by Toei to stagger the beginning of the Kamen Rider series as each year with the beginning of the Super Sentai shows each year. It used to be that they would start both in February. And so in order to space out merchandising, they would start having one debut in February, and then they would have one debut in the fall of the same year. So you would get them spaced out a little bit more and not cut your own throat at the toy store. So we have that, which is also why this is a 6-part series on Decade rather than a 10-part series like we did for Zyuranger. So with that bit of background, we're going to take a look at 5 episodes today. We are looking at, and it'll explain why Kuga is sitting here, Episode 1, Rider War. Episode 2, The World of Kuga. Episode 3, Transcendence. Episode 4, Second Movement, Kiva the Prince. And Episode 5, Qualifications of the Biting King. Now, we are obviously watching a fan-subbed version of this series. there is only one American release, North American Region 1 release of a Kamen Rider television series, and it's not Decade. The only Kamen Rider television series to get a North American release is Kamen Rider V3, which can be picked up at GenerationKakida.com. It's not really in stores. You can even find it on Amazon, though. And it's a little pricey. It's the whole series for about $100 and something, but it is an awesome show. I've seen all of it. Don't own it yet. It'll wind up here someday. But with Kamen Rider Decade, again, it is a fan sub-series. You can find it out there from a number of sources. We're not going to say which one we used. Please don't ask. But you can find it in any number of places. The only thing that I always recommend if you're looking at a fan sub is if you're going to get it, don't pay for it. Simple as that, because if you are paying for it, I can guarantee you Toei and the folks behind Kamen Rider will not see a dime of that. So remember, fan subs are best done by fans for the love of the game and are put out there for people to enjoy. And then if the show is ever properly released, then at that point it is usually pulled. So, by the better fan subbers out there anyway. So, as we look at these 5 episodes, a couple of things with Kamen Rider Decade. We always go through some basic stuff. Like I said, if you've watched this show for the last 9 weeks, 10 weeks, then you realize that we go through things not in overly great detail. We look at generalities, impressions, things of that nature. So this is your first episode of the DenziBlitz. If you're looking for episode-by-episode in-depth discussion, you're watching the wrong show. If we ever cover Decade on DenziCaster, then you'll want to check it out there, because we'll go through it a couple episodes at a time, and the episodes of DenziCaster are generally longer than these. So we look at it in, like I say, generalities and its impressions and thoughts. And a lot of times with the shows we've watched thus far, it's in some cases my own nostalgia kicking in, because the shows we're choosing, frankly, are my choosing, because they're shows that I either have some great interest in or some attachment to. And Decade is the show that opened the door for me when it comes to the Kamen Rider franchise. I had been a fan of Super Sentai for a while, before this show came out. My first Super Sentai was Deca Ranger, which will be the next show we talk about here on the DenziBlitz in just a few weeks' time. But Decade was, like I say, the show that introduced me to Kamen Rider. And what I think is wonderful about Decade is that it is essentially the Whitman sampler box of Kamen Rider. And if you're unfamiliar with what that means, Whitman sampler is a candy that you can pick up at various drugstores and department stores, but they have the sampler box, and it is literally just a box full of 1 or 2 of various different types of candy so that you can get a taste of a wide variety. That, to me, is very much what Decade is. Decade is also one of the most divisive Kamen Rider series out there. There are people who either love it, or there are people out there who really, truly hate it. I fall into the former. I really love it. It starts a few trends in Kamen Rider. One of those being the 2-episode arcs, which really get solidified with this series. There had been 2-part episodes in many of the shows that came before this. Kiva did it. I think Den-O does it. But this show really hammers the 2-part episode thing home. When the Heisei era first starts, it's very serialized. Decade is the first one where pretty much everything is a 2-parter all the way through. There is still a continuous serialized story, but the nature of Decade's story is several small stories woven into one larger narrative. The Rider War sets everything up, and in many ways, your central character for this show is not Decade. In many ways, your central character is Natsumi. Kamen Rider, for eons untold, since the beginning of time, when it comes to kung fu insect cyborgs, has been that there's always a girl that is a sidekick to our hero. And in this case, it is Natsumi. And Natsumi is basically the first dramatic character we see. The Rider War opens up with what, frankly, is this apocalyptic dream that if you were a Rider fan in 2009, you never thought you would see, which was all of the Heisei Riders, not just the main riders, but the secondary riders, all of them, fighting a war in this almost apocalyptic dream, with Natsumi standing in the middle of it in this white dress. And we come to find out that they are all fighting against one person. They're fighting against Decade. And we see Decade long before, and even hear his name, long before we see Tsukasa in the show. We eventually do see Tsukasa, and we figure out through Wataru Kurenai, who was Kamen Rider Kiva. Kiva was the show that immediately preceded Decade. Kurenai shows up and explains that there are 9 worlds. Each one has given birth to a rider. And in order to save his world, Decade will have to destroy the other 9 riders. So it's a fairly bleak setup to the series. And he is referred to repeatedly throughout the entire series, not just these 5 episodes, as the Destroyer of Worlds, the Devil. So we have that episode which sets up the premise. The Hikari Photo Studio, which Natsumi and her grandfather run, serves as our portal between dimensions. And the next 2 episodes, we find ourselves in the world of Kamen Rider Kuga. Kuga is the original Heisei Kamen Rider. He's the first one. The interesting thing about this show, and we find out, and they tell us very early on, the worlds have started to change. In no instance of a Heisei Rider returning do we get the original actor. Truthfully, I don't know if it was by design or if it was by circumstance. But every one of these Rider worlds we go to, where we explore the world of a previous television series, it is an alternate reality. You'll see the term AR world used periodically throughout different Wikipedia entries and blogs and such, different write-ups about this series. And the worlds are close enough to get you the flavor and the generality of each series without, one, giving away what happens in that series. If you watch the second and third episode of Decade and you really like the world of Kuga, nothing from the Kuga television series has been spoiled. You've actually seen none of the characters from the Kuga television series, and you can go back and watch Kuga all the way through, and it's going to be a similar flavor, but it's not going to be the same thing. So we go to the world of Kuga, and here's where another neat thing that Decade does comes in. Each Kamen Rider series tends to have a specific format to the way their episodes are titled. With Decade, whenever they travel to one of these other Rider worlds, the episodes are titled as if they were part of that series. So, for instance, calling it The World of Kuga is not terribly unlike what Kuga's naming conventions were for their series. In the world of Kuga, we meet Kamen Rider Kuga. In this case, it's Yusuke Onodera. They tend to keep at least part of the original character names for this series with the alternate riders. And Kuga is essentially fighting the Grongi. It's very much like the television series Kamen Rider Kuga, where there is a ancient race who are performing some strange ritualistic game that our hero has to stop. And that's where this series picks up, in the world of Kuga. He has presumably been Kamen Rider Kuga for some time. And in his 2 episodes, we get another basic premise of the series, which is that all of the other riders, all of the alternate reality riders, are under the impression that Decade is the devil. Someone has told them this. Whether it is a third party, which we do see this shadowy figure in a trench coat and a hat and glasses, who will later utter one of the greatest catchphrases in Kamen Rider history. we'll get there when we get there. And as of yet unnamed. And he is the one who not only gives this version of Kuga his powers, he's there when Kuga gets the belt, but he's the one that tells Kuga, Decade is the devil. He is your true enemy. He will destroy your world. And so we hit upon that premise that will be a recurring theme throughout the series. We also hit on the premise that each world will see Tsukasa in a different role. What does this world's version of Tsukasa do? In the real world, the world we first see, he is a photographer. In Kuga's world, he's a police officer, which is not that odd a stretch because that was a big thing in Kuga, was Kuga worked with the police. And we hit upon our third trope and theme for the series, which is that in order to expand his powers, Decade must earn the trust of each previous rider. He has something specific he has to do in that world before that trust and those powers are unlocked. In the first episode, Rider War, we actually see Decade at full strength, able to access the powers of all the previous riders of the Heisei era, the 9 rider worlds. He can access all of their powers, but as soon as he uses them, they fade away. And he knows how to fight. He knows how to use these powers instinctively. For the first time ever in one of these shows that I can recall, the hero actually wonders, how in the world do I know how to do this? He openly wonders that. He doesn't know. So there's obviously information that is stored, muscle memory or whatnot, that he just doesn't remember. And that's another thing that goes kind of throughout the series. One of Decade's catchphrases, I get the gist of it, even if he doesn't fully understand. So we get through the 2 episodes of Kuga, we move into our 2 Kiva episodes, which have a more unique story, rather than Kuga's world, which was basically just solve the mystery and go on with life, essentially, which was a very basic episode setup from Kuga. In this batch, these 2 parts, second movement, Kiva the Prince, and qualifications of the Biting King. With those 2 episodes, we meet Wataru. Wataru is a small child. Unlike Wataru Kurenai, who we meet in the first couple episodes, Wataru Kurenai played by the same actor that played him in Kiva. So we actually do meet some of the original Rider actors, but not in the individual Rider worlds. In the worlds, things have gotten a little askew. In this world, very different from the Kiva television series, the Fangire, which are they are the antagonists in the Kiva television series. They're the monsters, who have a very unique gothic stained glass aesthetic to them. The Fangire, who are a monstrous riff on vampires. Kiva was a gothically themed series. Live hand in hand with humanity instead of terrorizing them and trying to drink their life energy, sort of a Kamen Rider version of sucking their blood. And they live in peace. And there are Fangire enforcers and human enforcers, guards, who impose, who protect and enforce the law that Fangires and humans coexist. We live together. Wataru is the prince of the Fangires. There has been no king for 10 years. His advisors want him to take the throne. His advisors, whose proper names escape me, but basically it's the Frankenstein monster, the creature from the Black Lagoon, and the Wolfman. So there's plenty of homages to classic movie monsters in the Kiva television series. But in this 2-parter, the whole bit of the story is Wataru does not want to become king because he doesn't feel he's qualified. He doesn't feel that he's up to it. And it's up to Decade to teach him, yes, you are. You are meant to be king. In the midst of all this, we also see Yusuke, alternate reality Kuga, show up. At the end of his two-parter, Yusuke promises his dying partner that he is going to protect everyone's smile. And he resolves himself to go on his own journey. And a small white bat from Kiva, very much like Kivat, the bat that Kamen Rider Kiva would use to transform, named Kivala, basically transports him into Kiva's world ahead of Tsukasa, and winds up, he becomes one of the human guards of Wataru. So you have that story where Kuga and Decade are going to convince Wataru and show him, yes, you are meant to be king. And through teaching him that lesson and getting him to accept not only that he is king of the Fangires, that he can bring peace, and that he can be Kamen Rider Kiva, we get the next step of Decade's puzzle put together. We also wind up with two new cast members in the Hikari studio. Yusuke resolves himself. He is going to travel with Decade. He is going to travel with Tsukasa and become his partner as they go from world to world to world. It was very odd, I remember when I first watched the series, to think that the original Heisei Kamen Rider, yes, it's an alternate version of him, but still, it's Kuga. Kuga, who was the star of his series, is now the secondary rider for Decade's series. It was a very intriguing concept and one that I really dug and still do. So we have that. And Kivala, the little white bat, decides to join along. We still see the shadowy figure in the trench coat who vows to bring about the end of Decade. We also see over the course of the 4 episodes, presumably it's the shadowy figure. I haven't watched this show all the way through in a long time, so I'm trying to suppress the memory and go off of what I'm seeing, to be honest. What you can only assume is this shadowy trench-coated figure is able to call in other riders, specifically secondary riders. We see Kick Hopper and Punch Hopper, both from Kamen Rider Kabuto, and we see Kamen Rider Kaiza from the series Phase. He's able to call on these riders to try and stop Tsukasa, and does with some regularity. So we are having this dynamic. We see that at least one rider has befriended Tsukasa, is willing to believe in him and willing to travel with him to save the worlds, all of them. In the meantime, there is this other figure that, for whatever reason, is opposed to Tsukasa because he is the destroyer of worlds. He's going to destroy everything. That's what Decade does. So that's where the dynamic sets. And going into the next couple episodes, we'll be traveling into the world of Ryuki, which was one of my favorite Kamen Rider series of all time. I love Ryuki, a wonderful show. So we're going to be going into that couple of episodes. The look for Decade. Decade was very interesting in his attire. This is Kamen Rider Decade here. I will hold him up close to the camera. I do collect SH Figure Arts, and so that's what I'm using here as reference for some of these characters. Very unique in that he is the only, until Gaim, I guess, he is the only pink rider, although he does take exception to that at one point in one of the little shorts that they do for the series, and explains that he is not pink, he is magenta. That is one of the colors of photography, and hence the fact that he's magenta and he likes photos. It was a very unique design, very asymmetrical, which was also very different for Kamen Rider at the time, and probably has been fairly different since. But I like the look. I believe the actor's name is Masahiro Inoue, that plays Tsukasa, and does a wonderful job. He's one of my favorite rider hero actors. And of course, the stunts are fantastic. The suit acting is fantastic. Seiji Takaiwa plays Decade in the suit, as he has played pretty much every Kamen Rider in memoriam. He started, I think, with Agito, and the only Kamen Rider he has not played since Agito was Hibiki. So he's played the main rider for a majority of the Heisei series. I think all the way going to today with Kamen Rider, as of the time we're recording this, Kamen Rider Decade. So he definitely knows what he's doing inside the suit. And it comes off very seamless that it's the same character, because he's still very arrogant and very cocky in his movement, very sure of himself, much like Tsukasa is as verbally as a character. The music is fantastic. The opening theme, Journey Through the Decade, is by Gact, who many people out there probably know. If you ever want to know what Gact looks like, go watch a movie called Bunraku. He's one of the stars of it. As some of my friends have put it, the most beautiful man in Japan. But all in all, so far the first 5 episodes, nothing really to complain about. The only thing that some people out there genuinely do not like is the AR worlds. The idea that they did not bring back the original actors, the original characters. I kind of forgive that, because this was the experiment in many ways. They got away with it in Gokaiger for a multitude of reasons, to be perfectly honest. They probably were not going to be able to get back all of the original actors for the Kamen Rider franchise, because a few of them, bridges had been burned fairly badly. Joe Odagiri, who played Kuga in the original Kuga television series, I'm fairly certain has gone on record saying he wants nothing to do with the Kamen Rider franchise ever again. The gentleman whose name escapes me that played Hibiki, I know it's actually fairly public knowledge that he felt, I don't think betrayed would be an incorrect way of phrasing it, with the way the creative team was handled for Hibiki. One day we'll cover that show, because Hibiki's another show I really do enjoy. But it's almost two distinctly different television shows, because of a switch in the creative team halfway through. So you have very different worlds from their source materials, but from an ambiance standpoint, it's the same feel. I really do like that. I like variations on a theme, so far, so good. We've got 5 more episodes coming up next week. We're going to be kicking in with Ryuki's World on our next episode, so definitely stay tuned for that. Of course, check out all the great shows here on Instagram. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/DenziCaster. Go jump over there and check that out. We just put up last week our Essential Zyuranger guide that takes out all the filler episodes. I may do a similar guide for Decade. The only problem is Decade is a really short show, so there isn't necessarily a whole lot of filler to it. They cover stuff in every episode that you kind of need to see. So, but I may do something similar for Decade. And also, please, if you'd like to support not just DenziBlitz and DenziCaster, but all the shows here on the ECS network, please go check out our store over at cafepress.com. It's cafepress.com/ECS network. Lots of cool merch over there. Check it out. Get yourself a sweet t-shirt, or maybe some drinking glasses or whatnot. All the money there goes to support this show and all the other shows on the network. It does not go to line anyone's pockets. It does not go to buy Figuarts or anything like that. We don't do toy reviews. But it's new cameras, new lighting, new computer, new software, new releases, if it's something that's been released here in the States on DVD or Blu-ray, stuff like that, for us to review here on our various shows. So please go over there and pick yourself up something nice for yourself or for a friend, and help support the ECS network. Until next week, when we've got a couple of more episodes, well, a couple of 5 episodes of Kamen Rider Decade coming your way. I'm Mike. We'll see you next week on the DenziBlitz.